My name is Todd Fernandez with Climate Crisis Policy, and I'll be your host today. A very warm welcome to over 600 registrants, 400 with organizations, and 200 citizen activists from around the world. And a huge thanks to the presenters and co-hosts for making this gathering so impressive and appealing. Today, we're discussing the plan to save life as we know it on Earth. You'll hear from scientists on the top 100 solutions to greenhouse gases, a team of lawyers drafting legislation to match the solutions. We'll share digests of sample laws and policy proposals from over 130 groups that organize the information and reveal our common ground. We'll also hear from organizers working on existing bills and securing co-sponsors, and from a special guest working in Congress who wrote some of the bills. The big question we'll try to tackle is, what is civil society's plan to pass major climate legislation in 2021? What is the plan to mobilize as a people to save our collective home, to protect the Garden of Eden from the love of money, to save nature and ourselves? It's a big topic, and for more discussion, we'll have a second call on July 15th, also at noon. The senior counsel from the U.S. House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, Samantha Medlock, is tentatively scheduled to come to discuss their brand new report, A Climate Crisis Action Plan, containing 586 pages of policy recommendations. This is a landmark document for sure that just came out yesterday. After that, we'll have an open discussion about future organizing, and everyone is welcomed, and we'll send invites soon. Turning to today's discussion, we've asked several questions of the presenters in advance. As a legislative director, my first question is always, what is the solution? What is the demand that corresponds to the solution? This is the basis for all the organizing, voting, and direct action. Basically, we need to know what we want in order to manifest it. And at this point, that means detailed legislation. You've probably heard of comprehensive immigration reform, the DREAM Act, Medicare for All Act, the Equality Act. These are the demands of the LGBTQ immigration and healthcare movements. The Civil Rights Act, the Equal Rights Amendment, brands that match the policy demands. So what is the bill to solve the climate crisis? The Green New Deal comes to mind, thankfully. However, that isn't a bill with policy fixes. It's a rallying cry to an ideal that Congress must pass comprehensive legislation to stop this crisis in time. But what legislation? The good news is that in 2021, we are likely to have an opportunity to pass planet-saving policy. But we need to figure out what that entails now in 2020 and get broad buy-in so we're ready for the ultimate showdown in 2021. We'll cover examples of this kind of bill preparation today, but we need this for all of the topics so we can be united well before the big push begins. And we need capacity and infrastructure with a formal network that is public-facing, transparent, and inclusive. Entering this moment without prior agreement on demands could lead to infighting and lost opportunity. Individually, we do not have enough power, but together we could be invincible. No matter how strong we become, this will be a Herculean effort against powerful entrenched interest. So we should not rely solely on political leadership. Civil society must rise up as one, as a pillar of democracy, and lead, not follow the legislative process, just as the opposition has always done. Fortunately, there's a vast array of organizations and activists devoted to saving our planet, many eager for a plan, it appears from today's crowd. But to have true hope and real political power, we need all the universities, the legal associations, the scientists, organizers, and congregations making the same demands together. We need them involved in drafting and filing the bills to have real investment, and we need the institutions themselves leading the charge. The Earth needs all nonprofits to maximize their allowable lobbying activities and join the fight to pass legislation to prevent the unthinkable. This need to become everyone's job, becomes passing federal legislation to change the trajectory of global warming is an imperative above all else. As goes the United States, so goes the world. And nothing in our history suggests we can succeed unless all of us organize in a new emergency mode, collectively focused on Congress. Human life has evolved successfully because of our ability to work together. This crisis is testing that in a million ways, but that is the challenge we face. Can we rise together in the next 6 months? Can we carve out enough time from our own plans to unite? Or will we ride the status quo over the cliff? As one way forward, we're proposing a climate bill package starting perhaps with the bills today that would grow over time, combined with a shared effort to seek co-sponsors divvying up the 435 congressional districts. There are enough of us on this call to cover them all. We'll talk more about this at the end and again on July 15th. It is a big lift for sure and one of the greatest opportunities of all time to do historic things. There are a million points of light in the climate cause. United in shared demands, we can be a laser that rewrites the future for all of life on Earth. Thankfully, the people on this call are all helping to guide the way. I'm very excited to share with you now what they have to say. First up, we have Chad Frischman. Chad is one of the leading scientists of my favorite book, Project Drawdown. It's a wonderful read and the expert outline of all the solutions and sectors where we need to make policy change to reduce greenhouse gases. Welcome, Chad. We're going to spotlight you now. We're so glad to have you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you everybody for joining today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited about the opportunity to speak with the panelists a little bit later and dive into this 500-page report that just released around the climate change, solving the climate crisis in the US. I haven't had a chance yet to read it, but I'm super excited to dive into it as soon as I can. But I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now. So I think one of the things that you mentioned, Todd, is what's really important is, and I just want to clarify, you can see the screen, correct?
Yes.
Big drawdown there, perfect. So one of the things that you mentioned is legislation, but legislation that does what? What is legislation actually doing? It's accelerating solutions to do something. I think first and foremost, we have to name what that thing is that we're trying to achieve when we're talking about the climate crisis, the climate emergency that we're facing today. Our proposition is that goal is drawdown. But what is drawdown for those of you who aren't familiar? Drawdown is that point in time when greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere begin to decline on a year-to-year basis. It's that point when we take out more greenhouse gases than we're putting into the atmosphere. And the proposition is rather simple. When we change the composition of concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we can affect global cooling. We can stop global warming and begin the slow but steady process of reversing it. But more than just a technical definition, drawdown is a new way of thinking about and acting on global warming. It's that marker on the horizon pointing us towards the future that we actually want, what we're trying to accelerate towards. And part of what we need to do is not just identify the real technologies and practices and the accelerators to implementing them, but we need to change the discourse that from which we approach the climate crisis from the baseline. We have been working in a system focused on problem fixing, identifying the problem and trying to figure out how to get it right. Well, we're also working on this this discourse around fear and conflict. And when you combine problem, fear, and conflict, this is a recipe for the status quo. It's a recipe for apathy. What we need is to change that discourse to one of solutions, possibility, and collaborations, identifying real technologies and practices, what they can actually achieve in time, and then working together, linking arms to making them happen. And this instead is a recipe for opportunities. Opportunities to create that future that we actually want sooner, today, with a level of urgency and equity and safety that we need in order to solve the climate crisis and a host of other challenges. But what are these opportunities actually addressing? They're addressing how we as a society, as a global society, our activities are emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And this is just an example of two areas that have, that are natural processes where we're emitting natural and human processes that we're emitting sources of greenhouse gases in a variety of different sectors, from electricity generation, food, agriculture and land use, industry, transportation, buildings, our built environment. These are emitting greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide, methane, fluorinated gases, and nitrous oxide, and a host of other greenhouse gas or heat trapping gases into the atmosphere. And we have we have what we call sinks. These are land and ocean sinks that absorb some of that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere back into natural systems. That's part of the natural carbon cycle. Unfortunately, because we're emitting so many greenhouse gases, so much, that 59% of that remains in the atmosphere. And that number is what we need to address with real technologies and practices to so that we can get to that point of drawdown where we're taking out more than we're putting into the atmosphere. What are these solutions? Well, I work with a team of researchers from all over the world. Over 83 researchers have taken part in our project, and we've identified over 80 technologies and practices that exist today that can achieve drawdown. And these are solutions that do one or more of three things to address those sources and sinks. They replace existing fossil fuel-based technologies and practices with clean, renewable alternatives. So first and foremost, stop fossil fuel combustion. 2, they reduce consumption or demand through technological efficiencies and behavior change. So we need to reduce consumption, right? Actually, this is probably even more important. First order, we need to reduce consumption, overconsumption overall, and switch out those technologies with clean, renewable alternatives. And 3, to restore carbon to restore the natural carbon cycle through natural carbon sinks, enhancing those sinks, improving them, and also maybe engineered sinks, that direct technology that pull out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it. When they become economically viable, scientifically valid, they could be very interesting coming attractions. But right now, we have a host of natural climate solutions that have been worked on for millions of years, and they do a really good job of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere through a process we all know and learn about in secondary school. It's the miracle of photosynthesis, which converts carbon dioxide into plants' biomass and soil organic carbon. It's through a combination of these 3 mechanisms, and really only these 3 mechanisms, that drawdown becomes possible. So these are solutions that address reducing the sources, enhancing the sinks, and ultimately improving society so that we can achieve that future that we actually want. But what are these technologies and practices? And I wanted to stress that what we have done at Drawdown is look at a global scale assessment of these solutions. And what we're showing here is the global results in terms of the total gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent that are either reduced, so reducing the sources, or pulled from the atmosphere through sequestration or through those sinks. And what you see here is about 20 of the 80 solutions. I can't really put all 80 on one slide, but this is a good way to just see the host of different types of solutions across sectors. And you'll see those numbers at the right of that slide. That represents gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's a combination of carbon dioxide, methane, fluorinated gases, and nitrous oxide. You'll see 2 scenarios here. One scenario is aligned with a 2-degree warming target. The second is a 1.5-degree warming target. But what I want to show here is kind of how this system of solutions that we've identified as being the really only mechanisms to get to drawdown in that future we want, really address almost all areas of human activity. And there are some surprises. I think first and foremost, when we typically think about climate solutions, we often think about electricity generation. We think about those coal, gas, and sometimes oil-fired plants for energy generation. And they're important. It's about 25% of global greenhouse gases come from electricity generation. And it's about in 2018, it's about 27% of greenhouse gases from the United States came from electricity generation. And they're incredibly important, right? Taken as a whole, we need to get to 100% clean, renewable grid as soon as possible. We have solutions in buildings and industry, however. So it's not just what we're combusting for our electricity generation. It's also what's being combusted on site in buildings and in our industrial processes. And that might be things like reducing electricity generation from buildings using insulation, so that's space heating and cooling, or LED lighting. Or it could also mean changing the way certain parts of the world are cooking their food to have improved clean cook stoves, which reduce black carbon reduce emissions and improve health outcomes for people. But it also might be thinking about how we cool our air in our refrigerators and air conditioners by switching out hydrofluorocarbons to natural alternatives, which exist today, and managing leakage of these hydrofluorocarbons in existing equipment. Just as some examples, because hydrofluorocarbons are hundreds to thousands of times more potent a greenhouse gas, heat trapping gas, than carbon dioxide. So we need to reassess our built environment and our industrial processes, as well as change how we think about our food systems. This is probably the most surprising sector, in my opinion. The decisions that we make every day about what we consume, how we produce that food, are perhaps, and how we're consuming, are perhaps the most important decisions every one of us makes, sometimes, hopefully, 3 times a day, globally, as well as in the United States in particular. We vastly overconsume food, and we vastly waste a tremendous amount of food, particularly in high-income countries, particularly in the United States. About 30 to 40% of food that is produced all over the world is not even consumed. And if we start to think about every drop of oil, every crust of bread as it goes through that supply chain, from production through harvesting and processing, through packaging, I mean, think about all the factories churning out metal and glass and paper and cardboard to put our food in, to put on trucks, planes, trains, transporting all over the world, all in big refrigerators and freezers to keep it fresh and cool, using hydrofluorocarbons to get to our markets, to get to our homes eventually, where sadly, when we walk home, it's like taking 3 full bags of groceries and taking one of them and throwing them, cardboard, plastic, tin, glass, and all, into the garbage. So that is the food system. And so when we start to think about the emissions, the energy, the labor, all the extra resources that are used throughout that supply chain, it becomes really obvious that these are decisions individuals can make every day, as well as businesses, as well as our institutions, as well as governments, enacting policies to support and accelerate not only how we to accelerate the adoption of agricultural solutions that improve our regenerative agriculture approaches that restore carbon to the land and increase productivity, but also change and help support changes in diet, behavior change, and support how we're managing, preventing food throughout that supply chain. So these are really important solutions that we make across the scale.
Hey, Chad, I think we're at close to time. So if you can get close to the ending, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Okay. So I just want to also point out that land sinks are incredibly important too. When we think about that, enhancing, expanding, and extending land sinks into from currently degraded lands, or protecting our current extant ecosystems, is incredibly important in the United States and all over the world, right? Because this is how drawdown actually happens. Not only do we avoid emissions going into the atmosphere by preventing degradation of these ecosystems, we enhance those things and we restore those things, which pull carbon every year into soil and plants. And of course, when we think about land and food together, this is the super surprising thing, is that these set of solutions are the most impactful things we can do globally and as a nation in order to solve this climate crisis. But we also have to think not only about each individual sector and set of solutions, we have to think about the system of systems and how all of these sectors are all intersecting, because they all do. Nothing operates in isolation. So is drawdown actually possible? And the answer is yes, but only when we challenge existing systems. And I'll just leave you with this slide, which shows the set of types of solutions and their relative impact as a system of systems, the drawdown system of systems, and a variety of different approaches that we can take to shifting to those alternatives, or replacing to alternatives, reducing consumption and enhancing sinks. We see this as an organic system that can achieve the 2-degree warming target, that can achieve the 1.5-degree warming target, that can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and can indeed have a financial return on that investment that makes this a no-brainer, creating opportunities that we actually want to build a regenerative future, because we, at the end of the day, are the regeneration. This is our opportunity to be an intergenerational movement to achieve these solutions through accelerating legislative policies, as well as bottom-up action, and middle-out transformation of businesses, educational institutions, financial institutions. We all have a role to play as part of the regeneration. So thank you for your time, and apologies for rushing through the end there.
That's great. No, I'm sorry to rush you. We're moving. That was wonderful, Chad. Thank you for introducing all of that. Next up, we have Rachel Goodgow, who's the Digest Director of Climate Crisis Policy and is getting a master's in climate policy at Columbia right now, and just an invaluable, dedicated activist who's an intrepid organizer. And thank you, Rachel, so much for joining us. I'll pull up your first slide. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Todd. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Climate Crisis Policy Digest, which is a great tool that our group has created. And then I'm going to just briefly touch on a few federal climate bills that we won't unfortunately have time to go into depth on today. So first, the digest. So the Climate Crisis Policy Digest is essentially a database of policy recommendations that lets activists discover the scope of ideas already out there to solve the climate crisis. We set out to collect proposals for federal climate action from a wide array of diverse sources and to reveal their commonalities in opinion. So far, we've extracted over 700 distinct policy ideas from over 130 documents that came from experts, advocates, and also legislators. Next slide, please. So the topic outline that you see here is from the homepage of our website. And we started with the DRAWDOWN topical framework that you heard a bit about from Chad. And we also added topics where needed in accordance with the documents we were researching, especially notably just transition for workers and environmental justice for overburdened communities. So the vast majority of our collected documents really call for making justice central to climate legislation. So you'll see on the environmental justice page recommendations from the Climate Justice Alliance, Poor People's Campaign, NAACP, and a lot of other groups, as well as provisions from laws and bills that are seeking to redress climate inequity. As you explore the website, you will see lists of recommendations in every sector and subtopic from the policy ideas from the documents. So here I've just put a snippet of the public transportation subtopic. You can see that many of the recommendations have multiple documents listed, which indicates supports from multiple sources for that same idea. Not all of our documents agree, of course, and especially as we add more federal bills, there are some provisions that are in contrast to our own beliefs. And I'm sure there is a bit of controversy around some of the things in the digest, but in general, we do see consensus emerging. And the digest is really meant to be a neutral educational tool to provide ideas and get conversation going around federal climate legislation. Next slide, please. There is no comprehensive climate bill yet, but there are many bills that deal with some aspects of the crisis. And right after me, you'll hear from our presenters today about 2 awesome bills on materials and 4 important bills regarding sustainable agriculture and land use. And there are a few others that I'm just going to point out that we won't be able to really discuss today, but are important to the conversation of current bills and of what's missing, what we still need to really push for, aside from the existing bills. So we have the Ban Fracking Act. That one's pretty clear exactly what it says. The main organization behind it is Food and Water Watch, and it's sponsored by Ocasio-Cortez in the House with 18 co-sponsors and Sanders in the Senate with 1 co-sponsor. Then there's the Clean Future Act. It's a huge draft bill from the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee, and the Energy Subcommittee that was released in January but has not been formally introduced. It's wide-ranging, covering energy, transportation, buildings, and financing, and it requires net zero emissions by 2050. The American Energy Innovation Act is a Senate compilation bill that includes more than 50 energy-related measures sponsored by senators from both parties. It was being strongly considered in early March before being derailed by some disputed amendments. Overall, the bill focuses on research, development, and demonstration in a variety of sectors, including energy, vehicles, and industry. It has several climate-friendly provisions, but it's not really meant to be a climate bill, more of an energy omnibus, and it has some provisions that actually further oil and gas development. There are also several introduced carbon tax bills in Congress. The most well-known is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which has 82 co-sponsors in the House and is supported by Citizens Climate Lobby. That bill targets a 90% emissions reduction from fossil fuels by 2050, and it also puts into effect a 10-year moratorium on certain greenhouse gas regulations. Another carbon tax option is the Climate Action Rebate Act, which currently has 6 sponsors in the House and 2 in the Senate. And that bill targets a 100% emissions reduction from fossil fuels by 2050 and does not suspend any additional regulation. The policy items in these bills can all be seen in the Climate Crisis Policy Digest alongside other proposals in their sectors and other bills. I'm now going to send you back to Todd and our next presenters.
Thank you so much, Rachel. As you can hear, our team is hard at work digesting and collecting information, so we have it all in one place. I'm going to speed along because we're already about 5 minutes behind schedule. Next up, we have Alex Hilbrand with the Natural Resource Defense Council. And Alex is going to talk about my favorite word that I never dreamed I would learn, hydrofluorocarbons. And some of our team have put on plays about hydrofluorocarbons. It's like the biggest thing since sliced bread, evidently, hydrofluorocarbons, and more importantly, getting rid of them. Alex, welcome. Greg, please spotlight Alex, and I'll stop my screen share. Oh no, I'm going to keep my screen share because I'm going to do your slides for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Todd. Yes, that's definitely the warmest welcome I've ever received on HFCs, so thank you. And also to Chad for priming you on what these things are and why we don't like them. So I'll say a bit about 2 companion bills currently in Congress that are basically a good shot at comprehensive climate legislation on HFCs. So it's, I invite you to step into the weeds with me as we talk about this particular basket of gases. So the status of this bill, it's just recently, in spite of the global situation, has been introduced and considered by subcommittee and committee in Congress. So we have a bill in the House sponsored by Representative Tonko with quite a few co-sponsors. We also have a version in the Senate that has been heard by EPW in committee. So what this bill does is it basically would be a economy-wide phase down of HFCs over the next 15 years, from 100% of a baseline to just about 15% of that baseline. And this would apply to production and use of these chemicals. So again, these are very potent greenhouse gases used inside fridges, ACs, foams, things like that. So this bill includes, its core is this phase down. It includes some authorities for EPA to subsequently block leakage, put rules in place to prevent leakage of these dangerous gases, encourage recycling, and to prohibit them altogether where appropriate. Thank you, Todd. Next slide. And so it's a good shot at comprehensive legislation in this area. There already has been legislation on its predecessor gases that were destroying the ozone layer in the stratosphere. You probably all know about this. So these HFCs came in to replace those, and now we've decided because they're such strong greenhouse gases, they've got to go. So how have we come to get this far? Basically through the Montreal Protocol, the UN treaty that governs these types of gases. Back in 2016, we forged an agreement to do that globally. Industry was there, the governments were there, the NGOs were there. And so ultimately this bill would implement that at home in the US. although it does not formally ratify it, which is something the Senate has to do. So part of the reason that these bills are seeing progress is that they adhere to the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments that came before them to phase out the gases that came before them. We had helpful precedent in this case. And because the environmental community, raised this issue and foisted it on industry and others, they've invested in these alternatives. These are also industrial gases, so there's a little more focus on industry here. And it appears that in Congress, a lot of that support has been very helpful. So again, we see support across both parties. Many environmentalists on file supporting this legislation. The industry, again, has come to see it happening, and by and large, the major groups representing the industry, for example, support this approach of legislation. There is still opposition. The bills have not been passed. Specific companies that don't want to be involved in this work to phase down HFCs or don't want to be affected by it, but generally don't oppose the approach overall. There's also some limited opposition, of course, on the basis of regulating climate pollutants, and also for the relationship between this federal legislation and states and state law and their ability to continue regulating in this area. And yes, this bill is also package friendly. So if there is true comprehensive climate legislation, this would be a good fit. It also has been considered as a part of the Senate energy bill that Rachel mentioned previously. So we're very hopeful. We leave you there. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex. We're very excited about that bill. It has all the support in the world, and it's a great example of, rallying everyone together on a cause, and you're going to hear more about that as the day goes on. Next up, we have Delia Ridge-Creamer from the Center for Biological Diversity, who's going to tell us about the plastics bill. And now, Greg, if you could highlight Delia, spotlight Delia. Are you there? Hi, Delia, welcome. And I have your slides, so feel free to go ahead. We're grateful to have you. Good to see you.
Great, I'm happy to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Delia. I'm a campaigner at the Center for Biological Diversity, where I work on oceans-related issues. And my email should be on the next slide. This is a rapid fire presentation on a huge topic, so I'm happy to have follow-up conversations. But I'll keep the overview of the problem brief. I'm going to be talking about the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act of 2020. If you hop to the next slide, the plastic pollution crisis is an intersectional issue involving public health, the climate, environmental justice, just to name a few. And the problem is that plastic is everywhere. With global plastic production planned to triple by 2050, it will account for 20% of global oil consumption. And how did we get here? Well, the fracking boom has fueled the plastics boom, and both are contributing to the climate crisis. And the plastic plants that make single-use plastics are super polluters, operating under egregiously outdated regulations, largely in low-income communities and communities of color. So the bottom line is we cannot recycle our way out of the plastic pollution problem. Only 9% of plastic waste has been recycled globally, with 16% being incinerated and over 75% going into a landfill or inundating our environment. So if you go to the next slide, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act was introduced by Senator Udall of New Mexico and Representative Lowenthal of Southern California. And it was super exciting to be a part of the broad coalition of organizations working on and supporting this legislation. The bill, if passed, I'll just give you like an overview of what it would do. This slide is more detailed, but I don't have time to get into all the provisions of the bill. Essentially, the bill, if passed, would enact a temporary pause on the construction of new plastic production plants until the EPA investigates the cumulative impacts of plastic production and updates regulations for the plastic producing facilities. It would shift the financial burden of waste management from taxpayers and local governments to the producers, which would move us to a more circular economy model. and it phases out some of the most environmentally harmful single-use plastic items like takeout containers, plastic utensils, and styrofoam, to name a few. So this piece of federal legislation is a roadmap to curbing the plastic pollution crisis. And one reason why it's so great is because it offers common sense solutions to the big picture impact of plastic. So not just looking at plastic as a downstream problem, but looking at it at the entire plastics life cycle from production to disposal. And as for the status of these two identical bills, they have both been referred to their respective subcommittees at the moment, so they have not passed. And then if you go to the next slide, the actual process of putting this bill together was really exciting. From the beginning, there's been a broad coalition working to support this bill. The authors of the bill worked together with advocacy organizations for over a year to bring to Congress what has been deemed the most comprehensive legislation ever introduced to tackle the plastic pollution crisis. And the language drafting was an open and deliberately iterative process. So the first 6 months, I've laid out the milestones in this slide, but the first 6 months were focused on stakeholder outreach and collaboration, and the author staffers had meetings with over 100 different stakeholders, including industry, advocacy groups, frontline and fence line communities, trade associations, businesses, just to name a few. And this coalition effort and input resulted in broad support for the bill. We have 70 House co-sponsors and 8 Senate co-sponsors currently, and there are over 500 organizations who have officially endorsed it. So support from the Break Free from Plastic Coalition, which is a global coalition, and buy-in from other stakeholders has resulted in a huge bill launch in February of 2020. And one reason for the success and support was, like I mentioned, the Break Free from Plastic Coalition, which is a global coalition, although there will always be more room to expand this coalition and have a broader, more intersectional movement. And understandably, COVID-19 has caused most legislation efforts to be put on the back burner for now, but we want to move this bill forward, and we are planning another co-sponsor push this month actually, in July. If you're looking at opposition, I'll just talk about that briefly. We're seeing the fossil fuel industry really feel the heat from the climate movement and shifting their focus from energy production to plastic production, which is their backup plan. And I just want to remind folks that big oil and big plastic are one and the same. These are the same companies, and we need to stop big oil from relying on producing more plastic as their economic and financial backup plan. So this bill is a great opportunity to make the connections between plastics, fossil fuels, and the climate crisis. And then one main opposition is industry lobbyist groups, the American Chemistry Council. If you go to the next slide, the American Chemistry Council commented against the provision, which would create a pause on new permits for plastic facilities. So industry does continue to support fall solutions and endorse federal legislation such as the Save Our Seas Act. They want the public to believe we can recycle our way out of this problem. But there have been coalition efforts to point to the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act instead of false legislative solutions such as Save Our Seas or the new one, which is Plastic Waste Reduction and Recycling Act. And plastic is also a huge agriculture issue, but it's not one directly addressed in this legislation. So that's also something to consider when we're talking about comprehensive climate legislation for next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia. I can't wait till we get rid of plastic. Next up, we have Corinna Gore from the Center for Earth Ethics. And I'm excited because Corinna has been involved a lot with the faith organizing in the world and with the Paris Accord. And so she and I have been talking about how are we going to bring the faith community into this conversation and other hot topics. So without further ado, welcome Corinna, and thank you so much for being here. Greg, you can spotlight Corinna, please. That would be great. And I'll stop my screen share. There we go.
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much, Todd. I am Corinna Gore. I am the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary, and I have been asked to give an ethical call to action. Ethics is simply about right and wrong, and as a field of thought, it is most powerful when a widely held deep sense of right and wrong is out of step with both laws and social norms. That is the case with the climate crisis today, and we must point it out clearly. The stunning truth of our situation is that the main drivers of global ecological destruction are perfectly legal and even socially encouraged. We know that half of the global warming emissions in the atmosphere now have been put up there in the past 20 years, the time in which we've known the most about this and had the most viable alternatives. Data and science and technology and common sense are not enough. The urgent work to be done is changing the laws, and the way to do so is to appeal to our deepest shared values. We need an ethical call to legislative advocacy. And thank you to everybody who has already been giving one and will be on the rest of the program. Most Americans sense and express that it is wrong to turn a blind eye to this trajectory that we're on, passing the burdens of climate impacts to the poor and vulnerable and to all future generations, allowing mass extinctions and extreme weather events to unfold with the consequences of certain and massive suffering and death. To confront the truth of it naturally causes moral indignation. And this is a force we need to be very mindful of and careful with. We cannot count on it doing the work on its own. It causes such discomfort, particularly in a situation in which most of us feel implicated in the systems that are part and parcel of all this, that it can be easily inverted into denial, despair, grief, and inaction and projection. We also live in a time that is so saturated with outrage that an effort to convey it is sometimes put into a funhouse mirror and turned back on itself. So this is all reason to take the discourse of ethics and morals very seriously in legislative advocacy. It is essential, and it is most powerful if it is used with intention and care. Religion can and does play an important role, as it has for other major movements for change around the world throughout history. One role is to call people to a sense of belonging that is deeper than political or partisan affiliation. Bishop Desmond Tutu said that the scriptural teaching that all human beings are made in the image of God was a key to ending apartheid in South Africa. Spiritual teachings and practices can also galvanize, inspire, and bring people together to act with courage and conviction. Mahatma Gandhi's notions of satyagraha, or truth force, and ahimsa, or nonviolence, helped bring down British imperial rule in India. And finally, there is organizational reach and power in faith communities. In the United States, we saw all of this in the civil rights movement, whose most powerful leader, of course, was a Baptist preacher who invoked scripture and practiced nonviolence and packed churches throughout the South and the country with people who were ready to march, vote, speak out, and fight for legislation. We have seen some of this in the climate movement already, and there is much more potential. In fact, I would argue that some of what is causing the most current excitement and traction around climate legislation, the emphasis on justice, has been voiced by faith-based climate leaders for some time. In August of 2013, Reverend Gerald Durley, currently the chairman of Interfaith Power and Light, wrote a piece that I was excited to read at the time, I remember, titled "Climate Change is a Civil Rights Issue," in which he laid it out, the racial disparities and impact of air and water pollution and in climate impacts and so on, the need to learn from the civil rights movement about what is called for in our time. And there are many other examples. One place to find them is to look at the many faith-based statements on climate change that are online that voice this in different and beautiful ways. We just had the 5-year anniversary of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. And it is important to acknowledge that this great effort was one of the driving forces behind the agreement in Paris. I was in Paris as a representative of the Climate Task Force of the Parliament of the World's Religions. Pope Francis's message was powerful in the international community. And it was also part of the leading edge of thought that has gotten us to this widespread realization we see in a lot of the climate legislation movement now, that social and ecological issues are intertwined. In the wake of the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Treaty, which is of course not in effect officially until the day after the next election, the We Are Still In movement has kept it alive. And there are hundreds of faith signatories, and there have been eloquent statements from faith leaders about that effort. I want to also say that there's been a tremendous push on divestment in faith communities, internationally and nationally, and to acknowledge the work of Green Faith and 350 and others on this front. This can influence legislative advocacy, this part of the movement, because it pulls together political force and will, and it crystallizes values. I've had the honor of witnessing and supporting some of the faith-based organizing work that has gone on in the US around climate, including by some people who are on this call. And I want to say that this is going on as we speak with some of the bills that are being presented on today, and it merits respect and support and expansion. In addition to the specific interfaith climate organizations I've already mentioned, there are faith-based groups from distinct religious traditions. I won't call them out by name in the interest of time, and also not getting in trouble leaving one out. The work of Indigenous peoples and organizations and First Nations themselves is also powerful and important with spiritual force for many deep reasons. And so coalitions of faith groups that are also in solidarity with Indigenous peoples has particularly strong resonance in legislative advocacy. Wrapping up, there are also...
Please. Sorry to interrupt. Yes, as soon as you can, Corinna.
Okay. There are green groups that have staffers designated to work on faith outreach, and perhaps most interesting in terms of immediate potential for legislative advocacy, there is energy and expertise in faith-based organizations and groups that have been focused on other advocacy efforts, but can laser focus attention on climate. Coalitions like Washington Interfaith Service Coalition, Church World Service, and others. So the work is powerful and ongoing. We can activate a grassroots network. It's not just about reaching across the ideological spectrum, but also bringing people off the sidelines and breathing life into the body politic. So now's the time to step it up on that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Corinna. I'm excited by all this because we need that. We need these congregations of the world to rise up and be our conscience, and more importantly, be our power. Next up, we're going to be turning to the world of food and farming agriculture. And I'm going to welcome, if I can share this, we're going to welcome Jake Davis from the Family Farm Action Alliance. Jake, welcome very much. It's wonderful to have you. We're running a little bit about behind time, 6-7 minutes, so we're all right. So you have 7 minutes because you're introducing the whole topic and 4 bills. So I'll stop my screen share, we'll spotlight you, and please have at it, and thank you for being here.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Todd, for having me, and thanks for making this a priority on the event here, and thanks to all the other folks who presented. The important notion of climate change in rural America sort of should go hand in hand, I think, for most folks that participate and work the land. I'm a farmer from Missouri and also work as the senior policy advisor for Family Farm Action Alliance, as well as consult on a number of these issues across the spectrum. And when we started looking at these issues a few years ago and thinking about what were the ways that we can begin to engage rural America on this issue, it was there was a fair bit of uncertainty about what the best approach is, and I think there's still some debate about what the best approach is to engage family farmers and rural communities on these issues. But we've really tried to take it from a 4-step approach in a lot of ways to think about the categories where we have to create movement around these issues that will bring along a huge community of advocates from not only farmers, but also those folks that live and work around the land in these rural areas. So we start with the premise that consolidation of the agribusiness sector is one of the biggest oppositions to making sure that we get comprehensive climate change legislation in the long run. That may be true in other sectors as well, and we know far too well that our entire economy is hyper consolidated. But what we know particularly in food and farm systems is that the hyper consolidation of those industries has led to significant opposition. So when you look at things like only 4 companies control 85% of beef production in this country, or only 2 companies control around 80% of all the agrochemical seed and chemical inputs that are put on our land, we recognize that hyper consolidation has to sort of be dealt with first. So the first bill that our organization and lots of there's a major coalition of folks behind the merger moratorium, the agribusiness merger moratorium bill that we've supported that was introduced by Senator Booker. I know you're going to hear from Adam Zipkin from Senator Booker's office later today, and Mark Pocan, Representative Mark Pocan's office, to really slow, at least put a major pause on any future hyper consolidation of our industry. And we recognize that even as that bill was introduced a couple of years ago, we've seen, further mergers approved, like the Bayer Monsanto merger, and things like the acquisition of one of the largest dairy companies in the world by another large conglomerate. So there's a real major concern that consolidation is the first thing that we need to deal with. The second step in that process, from our perspective, is that we also need to meet farmers and ranchers where they are. Most farmers and ranchers really want to be good quality stewards of the land, and they have a deep desire to make sure that they're doing the right thing for soil health, for wildlife, for the climate. But far too often, the programs that we sort of think of that support those things are woefully underfunded in places like USDA. So we approach that sector with a couple of major bills that folks are probably starting to become familiar with. First, the Climate Stewardship Act, which was introduced by Senator Booker's office and Representative Deb Haaland's office on the House side, and then the Climate Resilience Act, which was introduced by Representative Shelley Pingree, really focus on meeting farmers and ranchers, rural communities where they're at, doing things like investing in both research for climate hubs and those sorts of things, but also in technical assistance to make sure that farmers and ranchers know how to implement what we figure out is the best natural climate solution, as we heard earlier, that can be a huge sector. It does things to address food waste. It does things to address renewable energy, investing in things like the Renewable Energy for America program that helps put that renewable energy directly on farms and in small businesses in rural communities. And then probably most significantly, both of those bills really focus on the major, what we call conservation title programs in the Farm Bill. Really making significant investments in things like the Conservation Stewardship Program, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and others, to name a few, to sort of include those in that process. It also, both of those bills also focus on an idea of building local and regional food systems, because we know that when folks are closer to where their food is produced, that they ask more questions of the farmers, and they demand more action around those things. And we know that those farmers often get a little bit better share of the food dollar, and they can invest some of those food dollars back into climate resilience on their farm and participating in that process. So we get to that stage of meeting folks where they are, but unfortunately, the hyper consolidation in the industry and the idea that we need to get to a point where we have a different kind of agriculture is one where we also have to reform the system. So Senator Booker's office, Senator Warren's office, and Rep. Khanna also have introduced the Farm System Reform Act to deal with the major factory farms in our industry and how they both pollute the industry, but then how they also can be turned into, and how we can kind of move those animals from a hyper consolidated system into one that's ultimately more inclusive and allows more people to participate in the process and invests in a more sustainable, more regenerative kind of farm system. So I think that we do have to focus specifically, and there's more work obviously to do on that system reform. The final thing I'll say is that the other thing we recognize really specifically is that to get rural America buy-in to a broad spectrum of climate solutions, we need to have farmers at the table, and that doesn't just mean big industrial agribusiness at the table. It means a very diverse and inclusive group of family farmers that includes, indigenous folks from First Nations. It includes African Americans. It includes, farm workers. It needs to include a broad spectrum of those folks. And I would say that, there's a whole range of things in those bills that that focus on things like ensuring a fair wage, that for tree planting, which is another big sector of the Climate Stewardship Act, wetland restoration to focus on coastal communities. So there's a whole range of great policy in there that will hopefully include a huge community. So appreciate that and happy to talk more, at the end, Todd.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jake. I mean, this is obviously an extremely exciting and intersectional arena. One of the things that we are running late on time, but one of the things I love is it has provisions in there that will make profits from the sale of farmland tax exempt if you sell it to somebody from a disadvantaged community or a new farmer. So there are just interesting solutions. And there's also a provision to collate renewable energy on farmland and to integrate these ideas. So there's so much going on. It's extremely exciting, but we still have a lot to do. So next up, we have Etel Higonet from Mighty Earth, who I first met protesting cargo. Etel, welcome. I'm so excited about your topic because I love the idea of banning products from around the world that come from deforested places. So please take it away.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm Etel Higonet from Mighty Earth, which is an environmental organization. And I think what I'll talk about is very complementary to what Jake was just speaking about before me, who did a wonderful job talking about the structural ways to address the hyper-consolidation of titans of agriculture and how we can also meet farmers where they are and create systems for regenerative ag in the US with the Climate Stewardship Act. And after me, we'll have Adam Zipkin from Senator Booker's office talking about that wonderful Farm System Reform Act to change CAFOs, which we signed on to as an endorsing org. So what I'll do in the middle is to talk about agriculture and deforestation around the world. Corinna spoke about how social and ecological harms are often intertwined. And I think what's important and interesting for folks to remember is that when we talk about agriculture in the US and food systems as they impact Americans, it's totally intertwined with what's happening around the world. And so what do I mean by that? The US is one of the world's largest producers and consumers of agricultural commodities. And as Todd and Chad had mentioned earlier, 1/3 of climate change in the world pretty much is due to agriculture. A lot of cattle, so that's I think where what Jake was talking about and what Adam will talk about, it really comes in. But a lot of that is also from deforestation around the world, particularly in often for cattle, but also for soy, for palm oil, perhaps most notoriously, and for other tropical commodities like rubber, cocoa, and coffee. So, it's of course true that this agricultural destruction, which drives deforestation, is also at the heart of mass extinction that Corinna flagged up. We're entering the age of the Anthropocene. Around 80% of the insects, give or take, we think, mostly worldwide. It's not necessarily extinction, it's often extirpation, but that has a tremendous ripple, 30% of the birds in North America already being gone. And so how we rethink the supply chains the agricultural commodity supply chains and create regulation that addresses deforestation in those supply chains is crucial. I'll just say, which perspective that Corinna and others have talked about, deforestation in the tropics that winds up embedded in palm oil, cocoa, coffee, rubber, soy, beef, and import into the United States is often really also soaked not only with destruction of forest, but with indigenous regulations, land grabbing, violence against communities that dare to resist. And it is impregnated with violations of labor rights, ranging from things like child labor, where you have 1 million kids working in cocoa, 96% of whom are in hazardous forms of child labor, but also bonded labor, which is extremely common in palm oil, and even slave labor, which you see sometimes in beef in Latin America. So regulation in the United States that captures and ends and cracks down on imported deforestation can and must also recognize the ways in which the deforestation, particularly in places that aren't very well regulated, like right now in the Amazon in Brazil and the Cerrado, where we're seeing so many abuses, that the regulation must capture both human rights and environmental harms. So there's good news and bad news. I'll talk a little bit about this California Deforestation Procurement Act. The champion NGO that's been really fighting for that is Friends of the Earth US. That California bill came extremely close last time, just one vote short, if my memory serves me right, and is going to be reintroduced, and was so successful that now New York has made essentially a kind of a copycat bill. And that California Deforestation Free Procurement Act, AB 2002, would address products linked to deforestation and climate change. It would require that it would make the state of California require that any contractors supplying products that might be linked to tropical deforestation would require no deforestation policies and procedures. It's very robust. And what's exciting is not only that it's had this ripple effect in New York, we hope other progressive states will step up and follow as well. But we also hope this will build momentum for a federal bill. And there has been, in fact, such momentum. It's not yet out, but perhaps in time for the next event that Todd organizes, it will be out and ready. There's a wonderful NGO leading the charge for the federal bill, much like Friends of the Earth has been a true champion for the California bill. And this federal bill, if it comes to pass, with potentially bipartisan support, would be a really robust tool to combat illegal deforestation in super high-risk commodities. It would oblige companies to carry out supply chain due diligence and declare details to customs and establish new avenues of foreign assistance to support producer countries' efforts to tackle deforestation. And that's kind of like what Jake was talking about, that you need to incentivize farmers positively and meet them where they are, as well as put in place hard lines, red lines that folks can't cross. So what's very interesting and important is not only that the New York bill, the California bill, the potential federal bill are all kind of this brewing up of an endeavor to crack down on imported deforestation and associated human rights violations, but this comes alongside major momentum in the EU, where in France, a devoir de vigilance law has already been passed and is in force. And now the European Union is about to regulate, and they've announced this, they've repeated it. Mighty Earth has been selected as one of these NGOs to advise. We're very optimistic that the EU will regulate, and it will be crucial for American regulation, EU and Chinese regulation to be synergistic so that you don't end up with leakage markets, with one consumer area cracking down when others open up. And so I think well, I'll echo Corinna, is that we're all in this together. And so now I'll hand it over to our next speaker, who's going to talk about something that's extremely synergistic with what I just said.
Wonderful, Tel, that's so exciting. Now we'll just go straight to Adam Zivkin. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited. I've enjoyed talking with you and seeing how much emphasis you're putting on drafting bills and bringing civil society together on things. And it's really your work is an example, I think, of what we need to do on all the other sectors where we don't have the kinds of bills and leadership that we're hearing about. So I'm grateful that you're here and to help us understand how civil society working better together over the next 6 months could prepare us for the big showdown next year when we really want to pass these bills.
Well, thank you so much, Todd, for inviting me and including me in this webinar. And I'll start with the question of what should the larger strategy be to draft and pass comprehensive federal climate legislation in 2021. And, I think the first thing I would note is that the macro conditions have changed, right? Like, so obviously none of us saw COVID-19 and this coronavirus coming, and none of us wished this on our country or the world. But the fact is that we are now living in a different world where this crisis creates opportunities. And I think one of the biggest challenges to comprehensive federal climate legislation next year was, could we build enough support to do a big enough bill? Would there be enough appetite to spend and invest at the scale that the scientists are telling us we need to act quickly to address the problem? And I think that has been solved to a certain extent, in the sense that we've passed trillions of dollars of legislation in the past few months. And I think that the idea of recovery, stimulus, infrastructure investment next year in the trillions of dollars is now mainstream and needed. You know, sort of there was talk of a Green New Deal, and we needed it from a climate change perspective, but we didn't really have the economic conditions that where people would say, yeah, we need another New Deal. We now have that. And so I think with that sort of macro conditions, what the House Select Committee put out yesterday is a great blueprint that we can all look to for creating a big federal bill that can achieve what we're all hoping to achieve. And I think that we need to keep in mind, you know, I work in the Senate, and so it's great that this House report is comprehensive and focuses on all different types of legislation. And we're hearing about a lot of bills today that that are important and that we are leading and supporting on a lot of them. But for purposes of a big climate change bill next year, the path through the Senate is what's known as budget reconciliation. And what that creates is an opportunity to pass really big bills that are focused on spending and taxes with 50 votes in the Senate rather than the need for 60 votes. So that's how the Republicans passed their big tax bill a couple of years ago. They used this budget reconciliation process. And so where that leaves us for a climate change bill is still with, in my opinion, very, very substantial and sufficient tools to craft the kind of bill that we want and need. And so what it can do is it has the ability to spend an unlimited amount of money. There's no, at least for a 10-year period, we can, you know, the types of investments that the Green New Deal and other, you know, big climate change policies are advocating for fit right into this type of Senate reconciliation bill, as does any type of tax code changes. So doing a carbon tax, or getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, or increasing and expanding clean energy incentives for electric vehicles and solar and wind and energy store, all of that is on the tables. But I think that as we start to hone in on what we want to see pass as the big federal climate change bill next year, that's the lens that we should be analyzing through, is what can pass the Senate with 50 votes. And maybe in a few months, the landscape is such that we think we have 60 votes in the Senate to pass the scale of climate change legislation that we're all working day and night to try to make into a reality. But much more likely is we have a 50 vote path. And so we need to look through that lens. Two areas that I think are really important to be in that bill, and that can be in a 50 vote bill. One, which is what we've heard about from multiple speakers, starting with Chad and through others, around natural climate solutions. So Senator Booker introduced, and Deb Haaland led in the House, the Climate Stewardship Act. And it really has three components: massive reforestation, so planting billions of trees. And by the way, in the original New Deal, they planted 3 billion trees. And so we would, you know, build off of that. We would plant billions of trees. We would restore millions of acres of coastal wetlands. And then, as Jake described, we would make billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars of investments through voluntary existing USDA conservation programs to incentivize farmers and ranchers to be, you know, part of the climate change solution and substantially increase sequestration in the soil. And, you know, I think while it's a very important climate change mitigation bill, because of the potentially, you know, billions of tons of greenhouse gases that these forests and wetlands and soils can absorb, it's equally the co-benefits of focusing on natural climate solutions at that scale. You are creating wildlife habitat. And by the way, we're having a biodiversity crisis globally at the same time that we're having a climate change crisis, right? So this addresses that crisis as well, but it also protects our drinking water, makes our farms and communities more resilient to flooding and to future extreme weather events. It does all types of, it's climate change adaptation, as well as mitigation. And so I think it's just a critical piece to the puzzle. Obviously, we need to do all the other things that we need to do in terms of transitioning from fossil fuels, electrifying transportation sector, all that. And then the other thing is environmental justice. And I think where specifically from an investment perspective, we can help low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous communities in a really big way is by cleaning up legacy pollution. So Superfund sites and abandoned coal mines and former defense sites and replacing lead service lines in drinking water and making sure that all households have complete plumbing and wastewater disposal. All of that can be in this type of climate change bill, would disproportionately, would be just a justice aspect to the bill that is critically important and that can help these communities start to heal and ultimately, benefit fully in the clean energy economy that we all see happening. And so I'll close with just, I think that the ability to unify exists right now like never before. All of us who care so deeply about these issues and want to see a transformative federal bill next year, like it's all there for us to put together. And sure, we could fight about our differences, but that is not what makes sense. We can unify around really large scale action. And the way we structured the Climate Stewardship Act, we have family farm and ranch groups endorsing it, environmental groups focused on reforestation. We have the faith-based community, right? And those are the types of coalitions that we need to be building around this much bigger vision. And I'll just close with, I was very inspired by Karena's remarks, and I'm so happy to have the faith-based community as part of this conversation. I think they're such an important voice in terms of, just speaking to people about our need to care for God's creation. So I'm super excited to work with everyone, and thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I'm more excited about the future than I've been in a long time hearing you say that all. And it's wonderful. And we're doing okay on time. I just want to add that, when we go about this process, and Michael Gerard's going to talk about it now, I want us to focus on what the solutions are, draft bills to make the solution, not thinking about the politics, build the coalitions around all those bills with all the real solutions, and then see what the politics look like as we go into the showdown next year. Who knows? My belief is that with all of us united together and all these little individual issues combined, we are quite a force. So next up, we have Michael Gerard, who is one of my heroes for his work, the legal pathways to deep decarbonization in the United States, and who has a team of lawyers drafting legislation, sample legislation on all of these fronts. And he's going to tell us all about that. So we've gone from the scientists and the solution through several bills that are already in play. And now Michael's going to show us the big picture of a comprehensive effort drafting legislation on a whole suite of solutions. Welcome, Michael. I'm so glad you're here. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Todd. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a project to draft model laws, not only at the federal level, but also at the state and local levels where much of the necessary action needs to happen. We started with a report that was issued in 2014 called Pathways to Deep Decarbonization of the United States that set forth basically pathways based on 4 pillars. The first pillar was electricity decarbonization, moving completely away from fossil fuels to generate electricity. This is similar to the replace idea under Project DRAWDOWN. Next is energy efficiency, greatly increasing the efficiency with which electricity and all other forms of energy are used. This is similar to the reduce part of Project DRAWDOWN. Then we have electrification, which is moving from fossil fuel use to electricity, primarily in the transport sector for passenger vehicles, for home heating, and for many other uses. This is another part of reduce. And finally, we have carbon capture, both from those remaining emitting sources, such as heavy industries that are hard to decarbonize, and from the atmosphere itself. And this is similar to the restore part of Project Drawdown. There are various scenarios under which this could happen, but let me just focus on the one on the left. This shows the trajectory of annual emissions down from where we are now to 2050. We see complete elimination of coal. We see virtual elimination of diesel and gasoline to power vehicles as they are replaced by electric vehicles that are powered by clean energy sources. We see some use of biofuels for the liquid fuels that still need to be used in order to run airplanes and some other things that are hard to use with electricity under current technology. So looking at these technical pathways, another law professor, John Dernbach, and I then asked the question, how does US law need to change in order to be on these pathways, federal and state and local? We enlisted about 50 lawyers around the country, mostly law professors, some practitioners, some with NGOs, to produce this book, which was published a year ago by the Environmental Law Institute. 1,200 pages, an exhaustive examination of the laws applicable to each of these pathways and recommendations for federal, state, and local action to be on these pathways. A lot of it is regulation, but there are also quite a few other types of legal tools that turn out to be useful and that are embodied in a number of the recommendations in the book. And so we divide it into several categories. First, electricity decarbonization, again, moving completely away from fossil fuels to generate electricity. That's done in part through utility scale renewables. That's primarily large scale wind, onshore and offshore, and utility scale solar. Distributed renewables, which is mostly rooftop solar. The transmission, distribution, and storage that are necessary to get the electricity to where it's needed. Some legacy nuclear, not building any new plants, some legacy hydro, and legal tools to phase out fossil fuels in the electricity sector. Fuel decarbonization, ways to use bioenergy feedstock to produce some of the remaining liquid and gaseous fuels that are needed for certain sectors. Carbon capture and negative emissions, of course, carbon capture from existing industrial sources, direct air capture from the atmosphere, and importantly, as we just have heard from several speakers, using the potential of agriculture and forestry to draw carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere. We then have the non-carbon dioxide climate pollutants, which also contribute to global warming, black carbon, methane, fluorinated gases, which we heard about, nitrous oxide. We set forth legal techniques that can be used to reduce each of those. And then finally, there are cross-cutting approaches to reducing emissions, carbon pricing, which we think is an important, it's not as sufficient, but it is an important element of the solution, needs to be coupled with adjustments so it doesn't have negative impacts on equity, technological innovation, financing, and other tools. Now, we don't want this book to just stay on the shelf, so we have launched a project to enlist pro bono lawyers around the country to draft the model laws that are necessary to implement all of these recommendations. A fellow named Rick Horsch, who recently retired as a partner in the law firm of White and Case, is heading up the effort to recruit and oversee pro bono law firms to do this drafting. So far, about 24 law firms have already signed up. We're looking to sign up more, as well as individual lawyers. We're also subjecting each of the model laws that has been drafted to outside peer review, and we're looking for peer reviewers. We have also set up something called the Renewable Energy Legal Defense Initiative, whose purpose is to provide pro bono legal representation to community groups and others that want wind and solar and the associated transmission and storage in their communities that are absolutely needed on a massive scale in order to meet our objectives, but that often face opposition. One of the big issues is that if we electrify transport and if we electrify the heating of buildings, we're going to need a massive increase in electricity. This is even after a major, very aggressive program of energy efficiency. We're going to need more electricity, not less. And all of that electricity needs to be met by clean sources, overwhelmingly wind and solar. And not everybody wants these nearby. And so that raises legal issues. In order to put all this information out there, we have created a website, the Model Laws to Decarbonization in the United States website, on which we're posting our model laws and all the others that we have found that already exist. And you can go on this website and find thousands of examples of laws that that may be useful, and we're adding to those all the time. Finally, in order to do all of this, we need volunteers. We need lawyers, more lawyers to draft the model laws and to peer review the model laws. We need people, not only lawyers, but activists of all kinds, to be promoting these model laws in Congress, which is our focus today, but also in state legislatures, city councils, town boards, all over the country, because only a fraction of this can be done at the federal level. And we need to defend renewables. So anyone who might want to get involved in that, this is contact information. We'll make these slides available, and I'll also put some of the contact information in the chat. So if you are a lawyer who might want to volunteer to do some drafting, Richard Horsch is the person. If you have expertise in a particular area. Marcy Kahn, who used to be a justice of the New York Supreme Court Appellate Division, is the person. John Dernbach and I are heading the overall project, and you're welcome to contact us. So we look forward to working with many of you in the years to come to get some of these model laws actually enacted into law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's very exciting. So as you can see, we have the pieces, and I'm just going to briefly talk about next. Let's see here, start my video. Next steps. And we'll see if we have a couple minutes for discussion afterwards. It's 1:24 now. So as you can see, we're in the conversation about leading the legislative process and getting everyone involved in that conversation much more deeply. It's a lot of people are weary of policy and legislative drafting and those kinds of things. It feels like it's a step beyond what they're interested in or comfortable being involved in. But I'm saying that now's the time we have to change that. We have to move out of our comfort zone, and we need more people willing to go into the weeds and look at this so that we can create compilations of bills that we know we support and that we can work on together. So as you see in hand, we're already well down this path. We have the scientists with 100 solutions. We have the advocacy community with over 130 reports showing where our overlap of opinion is. It's quite vast what people agree on. We have these teams of wonderful lawyers drafting policies on their visions of solutions, which are all linked to the other solutions. And then we have groups in Congress drafting and filing bills. So what's missing? There's a whole plethora of solutions without bills. We need to get those, and some of the more complicated aspects of this are not in legislation yet. There was something called the Off Fossil Fuels Act that we worked very hard on in 2018. We got 46 co-sponsors, and it was quite radical. It would have mandated all utility companies nationwide use only renewable energies. But we don't have a piece of legislation like that, and these bills are really important because they help us to clarify what we're demanding and call the question with all the elected officials and know who to vote for who supports which bills. Can't really have those litmus tests without the legislation. So we're just proposing and discussing the idea of moving forward with something of a climate bill package. And the idea would be that we would then unite to go after collecting the votes. I'm just going to spend 1 minute mentioning the LGBT Equality Act that I worked on. It was omnibus LGBT civil rights bill, just passed the House in 2019. We had multiple bills in the gay rights movement with different sponsors, and they became pet projects of certain folks. And we had to come together and file one comprehensive bill so that we could all know what we were fighting for together. And the Equality Act now has become the mantra from our movement, and I hear it on television every day and all over the time for pride, and it just warms my heart that we spent 6 years getting this movement to do that. Reform immigration for America. I was involved in the immigration movement in the Obama administration, and that was a nationwide coalition of the highest levels with massive marches and a fast on the Capitol lawn that went on for days. And then at the state level, we had the New York Immigration Coalition with 36 staff and full-time offices and 200 plus members that met monthly and worked on their legislative agendas. And they had a comprehensive immigration reform bill that had amnesty for 10 million people that passed the Senate. So we need that kind of capacity, and we need that kind of infrastructure. So for proposed next steps, we want to build this climate bill package, maybe starting with the bills today. There's plenty of I think we have 5, 6, 7, almost 8 bills that I think we could all agree on pretty straightforwardly, which is not that easy in this world. And that would give us something to start with, so that then all the groups that are going after sponsors for one of these bills is now going after sponsors for 8 of these bills. And already we're exponentially more powerful. We want to adopt a district, which we did before with the OFF Act, where individuals and groups can adopt a congressional district out of the 435. And then we know the organizer that's leading the organizing on the ground to get that sponsorship. We want to have bill discussions going forward. We have a lot of agreement. It feels like we don't because we spend a lot of time talking about the areas of disagreement, but we can have a process for that and a both and approach and majority and minority opinions. We can have all the bills and all the groups listed, and you can which groups support which bills. So we don't have to agree on everything to work together. And then we can embark on an education and public awareness campaign, building joint awareness of the solutions and the policy demands that are then also going to be relevant to our ability to implement these solutions and bring society enthusiastically into that effort. So we were going to have a poll. I don't know if we still have the poll, but if we have time to toss up the poll, Greg, we just wanted to see if you like the idea of creating a climate bill package. And I'm not sure how the voting works, but feel free to vote. Just as a general idea, do you like that concept? The second question is, are you interested in collaborating on federal legislation in a more formal way? The third question is, which aspect are you most interested in? The bill crafting work or the vote collection and the organizing associated with that? So I welcome everybody to please take that, and it'll give us an idea of what we have going forward in terms of energy. And I'll just say thank you all so much for coming together. It's really an honor to have such remarkable organizers and activists and leaders all together. And that was the vision. I wanted to bring us all together because I've been admiring all the pieces. And to me, the real task ahead of us is, can we collaborate collectively? And this is a huge challenge. I understand the difficulties of finding consensus on legislative agendas, but I think we can do it. And I think, if there's a will, there's a way, and we have the right energy at the right time and the right opportunity. So I'm hoping we will do that together. And with that, I'll conclude the formal presentation. So folks who had to go at 1:30 need to leave. And if the presenters want to stay, I'll just ask you, we'll go into presenter mode and see everyone if we could. And I'm just going to ask you to share your, I'll call on you, I guess, in the order in which we went. And just to see, real briefly, like a 1 minute each, any general thoughts on this issue of our coming together. And Chad, for example, how are we going to get the scientists to really get in the nitty gritty of policy fights? And the same with the faith community. I know it's really, we need more people. My assessment of the capacity of the environmental movement and the alignment of groups is that we have enough energy to file bills, but we don't have necessarily enough energy to pass them. So we need the scientists, unfortunately, to get into the nitty gritty. But just what if you have any general thoughts after everything you've heard about what we should do in the next 6 months so we're ready to roll into 2021 as a team.
Well, thanks so much, Todd. Thanks for all the panelists for such a wonderful collection of work that's being done in so many different areas. It's just a pleasure to be part of this. I'm afraid I do have to run at this hour. I wish I could stay a little bit longer because there are so many little discussions I want to have with all of you. Thank you so much. So that's a big question too. So I'm going to dodge the full answer as much as I can, because of timing. But what I would say is there's a lot of debate between in the climate movement and this sort of the conflict between should this be about individual action or collective action. And what I think is really testament to what this panel and the things that we've been talking about is that it's both, right? In order for us to really be enacting the change we need to address the climate emergency with the urgency that we need, with equity, right? Because that's really important. Social justice, equity, and human rights needs to be embedded, threaded through the entire set of solutions, through the entire system. We cannot do this without addressing these really important issues around justice and equity and participatory engagement at scale. And so we need that throughout all of this. To do so, we need to all take our individual actions and what we can do in our own lives, what we can do with our communities by knowing what we have taken on ourselves, knowing things that we can, additional things we could take on, and things that we can start to talk about to our friends, peers, our colleagues and communities. But we also need that top-down regulation, policymakers making real substantive acts of policy changes, financial mechanisms to accelerate these solutions because they have the responsibility to do so. But even perhaps more importantly, we need what I call the middle out, the transformation of our institutions themselves. This is where the individual actions of the bottom up and the top down meet as a we. We need to change the way we do business by fundamentally shifting institutions, educational institutions, financial institutions, corporations. The way we go about doing business as communities needs to shift fundamentally. And that means linking arms. And that's the only way we're going to do this is through collaboration and collective impact, not through competitive models of market-based. We need corporate capitalism. We need market-based, not corporate capitalism, collaborative capitalism, collaborative capitalism. And we need collaborative institutions from the start in order to address these types of changes at scale, local, national, global. We're all interconnected. This is a community of communities. And that is my only leaving a parting farewell to you all.
Thank you so much, Chad. I can't wait to continue this conversation with you. But the poll, we got 91% think a climate bill package is a good idea as a strategy, 173 people voting. Collaborating on federal legislation, 55% said yes and 45% said maybe. So that's good. That's a good start. And then in terms of which aspect they were interested in, 38% are interested in bill crafting, Michael, and 77% are interested in vote collecting. So that means we have a lot of amazing people ready to move forward. So everyone just remember, July 15th at noon, save the date. We're going to have another call. We're going to have the House Select Committee talk about their report, and then they will leave and we will have it among ourselves to discuss what this looks like in more detail. And everyone will be welcome to speak, and we'll have open mics and that kind of thing. So next up, Rachel, quick thought. So if everyone could keep it literally to 1 minute, that would be wonderful.
This is a huge question. I feel not quite qualified to answer it. And I think that we just heard today so many amazing bills and organizations all working super hard on really important solutions. And I personally think the climate bill package is an awesome way forward because we are stronger together and we all are doing such important and amazing things.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, Rachel. Well, no one's working harder than you. Alex, are you still with us? Oh, yes. Hi. Closing thought.
Hi, Todd. Thank you very much. I'm still here. Thanks to all the panelists. My closing thought is I agree. It's a hard question, but I certainly think, we have to get ready to throw all the spaghetti to the wall. And one thing I'll highlight maybe is that on this piece of, HFC legislation, it's uncommon to see some of the folks in support of the same bill, or all these folks that are supporting this bill on the same page about a topic. And I think that is an important strength of this piece of legislation, and the extent to which, you know, that can be replicated, obviously, it goes without saying, is for the best. So I suppose that speaks for coming together as much as we can. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And we really need and want NRDC. I know Gina McCarthy from years ago working in the Welch Lucci administrations. We need the NRDC's legislative and scientific and expertise, and to help us bring other people forward, because you speak with such authoritative gravitas. We definitely need to find the right policy folks within NRDC to work on the package together and to join that team. I think it would be very helpful. Next,
We look forward to that. Thank you, Todd.
Well, thank you, Alex. Delia?
Hi, Todd. Yeah, I would just say as a closing thought that I'm up for the challenge. The Center for Biological Diversity is up for the challenge. And I think if this call is an indication of anything, it's that we do have the people power and the strength to carry out the movement that will be needed to pass comprehensive climate legislation and support real comprehensive solutions. So excited to work on it in 2021.
Yeah, in 2020, we gotta figure this out now.
Yes,
so that
right
we're
now,
ready for 2021. The lag time, if you look at, I think it was your report, and you saw the lead time it took to get agreement. It took a year, basically. So, I mean, I wish we were having this call last year, frankly. So we don't have a lot of time, but we do have a lot of groundwork being done. So we'll see what we can do to unify in the journey. This little bit of time we have left, while we're also busily working on electoral politics for those who are not doing policy. Next, Corinna, closing thought.
Hi, thank you, Todd. I would love to be a part of this. I think now is the time. I'm with the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Seminary, and also have been inspired by this effort to get back in touch and to get newly in touch with many of the great faith-based organizers and activists and communities that are working so hard on this and have been for some time. I think that the confluence, this is an extraordinary moment in time. Needless to say, the coronavirus pandemic, the reckoning with racial injustice, these things have shifted perception and consciousness and the sense of what is possible. And it is definitely imperative that we take that for climate change and the climate crisis and work hard together on it. So thanks for the opportunity. I learned a lot from everybody. This was a wonderful thing. Thanks.
Thank you, Corinna. I'm so excited that we finally got all this together. Jake, thank you again for coming. Please, any final thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, Todd, for, I think I'm on. Yeah. Thanks for, having us, and Family Farm Action Alliance is eager. I think that one of the coolest things that could happen from a comprehensive package is that we can begin to count a huge spectrum of allies in this process. And look, independent family farmers are going to be climate change allies. I know that a lot of folks, at times are concerned about the perspective of farm groups and agriculture and where they're going to be on this perspective. But those independent family farmers who are on the ground, they see every day out their backyard, the effect that climate change is having on our community, from massive flooding in Nebraska to droughts and so those folks are going to recognize that that this is an important issue to be working on collectively. So including, and thanks to you, Todd, and others for thinking about including these rural and agricultural issues into that broader package, because that's going to bring a huge community of allies to the process. And we're just eager to be in the fight. Yay.
Well, that was my thought when I first started looking at the climate movement. I gravitated to Food and Water Watch because they were tackling both the energy front and the food and farm front. And my analysis of the political power was that none of these individual causes have enough political power to win against the triumphant of big ag, oil, and pharmaceuticals.
That's right.
And so unity is not only an ethical imperative, but it's a strategic imperative. And I see the activists. I'm thinking of the bee lovers and the bird lovers joining with renewable energy people and the plastics people, and then we will have protests that no one can ignore. So next up, Etel, please, your closing thoughts.
I echo a lot of what folks have been saying, that we are stronger together, and that by forging alliances between different groups, the labor rights folks, because there's so many abuses of labor rights embedded in agriculture, which are intertwined with the climate impacts, human rights folks, indigenous rights folks, as well as the environmentalists. I think forging alliances amongst constituents that stand up for justice, for rights, for the environment, for a cleaner future, this is the only way we're going to have the kind of change that we need. So I echo that very much. And I will say, in our own small world, we're already doing a lot of alliance building. Mighty Earth is part of the Child Labor Coalition, and we really support their fight. They've been doing a lot to help child farm workers. I think that this kind of alliance and respectful and true listening of the folks that do the human rights work, that's the necessary companion to the environmental work, is something we've got to do. And in our own small way, we're also at Mighty Earth working real closely with the people at Friends of the Earth that are champions for the California bill I mentioned. We're working very closely with the champions in the EU for European regulation. So actually my plea would be, let's do active listening and really respectful engagement with folks that are even trying to go for a global agenda to fight the climate crisis. And that will make us even stronger.
Wonderful. One of the digest reports on our climate crisis policy digest, one of the reports is the European Blueprint for a Green New Deal. And we just added that, and it has remarkable provisions in there that we're not really talking about real strong penalties for polluters and putting people in jail for different things. And the European community is being bold in its recommendations, and we include those so we can see the perspective of, to make sure that we're being as aggressive as we can possibly be as we draft and file legislation. But I'm so excited with what you're doing. I can't wait for that deforestation protection bill, and we'll add it to the bill package right away, I think. And on that, we'll have a discussion about how we add bills. This is a journey, so nothing's decided. And last, Michael, if you'd like to close us out with your closing thoughts.
So speaking for myself and not any tax exempt organizations with which I may be affiliated, the most important thing by far is the election. It's hard to imagine how the planet could stand another 4 years of Trump and McConnell. And so between now and November, getting out and registering voters in swing states is, I think, an absolutely central task. We no longer have the ability to go walk door to door and do this and ring doorbells, but there are a lot of phone banks and other methods to do that. And it's not only the federal races, but also who's elected at the state and local levels are extremely important. Without the right outcome in the election, none of this is going to happen. If we do have the right outcome, and particularly if there is a large margin, a great deal can happen.
Wonderful. And is the legal community, you think, ready to step into the fray on political advocacy? I'm a lawyer. I've been with law firms. I've never really, some do, some don't. Are we going to be able to get, because all of the contacts that you guys have, all the clients that you have, as an organizer, I just think that this is a window into a massive amount of political power. So do you think that we'll be able to rally the legal community to activism, advocacy, whatever you want to call it, on a set of climate bills?
A lot of individual lawyers would be very happy to engage. I don't see the American Bar Association or those kinds of organized groups coming together, because they have members who have clients all across the spectrum, including some of the industries that we're trying to fight. So I don't see that happening, but I think a whole lot of lawyers are energized to work on this individually.
All right, well, wonderful. That'll do. We'll take everyone individually. You can leave your affiliations behind. I will say that it's a serious plea to the nonprofit civil society of the United States to maximize your allowable lobbying expenditures. With the size of the institutions we're talking about, there's no reason why you couldn't have 1 or 2 or 10, frankly, people who are there to do education within the university systems, to just educating on the solutions and the fact that all these bills exist. That's not even lobbying. So you're not even into that realm yet. But there is an allowable amount of lobbying. And if this were a war, we wouldn't even be discussing can we or can we not under the law do something to save ourselves, to save our planet. So I think we need to break free of those constraints and go where no man has gone before in the spirit of Star Trek and, chart new territory. And we really need all the institutions to step up in a leadership role. And if they can't do it as an institution, then figure out what they can do. Figure out who can take point, who can help to organize from your mailing lists and get access to those lists. There's a million things we can do to organize with the millions of people that are in all these communities. And we need everyone in the game now. So without further ado, we've run a little bit, but I think it was a wonderful presentation. Again, July 15th, we'll talk more. We welcome everybody back to that, and we'll follow up with emails. And a huge thanks to everyone for participating in this. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.